Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Sophia Vogel, president of the Friends of Hannon Library at Southern Oregon University. And we're the ones who are putting the speaker series together every year to bring the community together. You are here because of this. And we also work to raise funds to enrich the Hannon Library's offerings, from adding rare books to the Marjorie Bailey Special Shakespeare collection, and also things like adding special databases that enhance student research projects. And if you too believe in the awesome power of libraries to make the world a better place, please join us and become a member of the Friends of Hannon Library. And you also get access to be able to check out items from the library, of course. I'll post the link in the Q&A. Just give me a minute for that, but I will. And if you happen to find yourself with some free time on your hands, as I'm sure most of you have tons of free time, and if you love great literature and libraries, we are currently looking for one new community member who would like to help us with that and joining the board. So, you could apply for that if you felt like it. For tonight's event, we have our own Irving Lubliner speaking about his book, Only Hope, My Mother and the Holocaust Brought to Light. Irving comes to us as an SOU emeritus professor who taught mathematics at every level, kindergarten through graduate school for 40 years. Here he is next to me. He has led all-day workshops for teachers in 39 states and delivered over 350 conference presentations, including several keynote addresses. Another one's coming right up for him. Since retiring in 2014, he's taught math, music, and literature classes for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, OLLI, as many of you know, and served on the Council of Directors for OLLI at SOU. In 2019, he created Falabra Press and published his mother's writing about her experiences during the Holocaust. And that book will serve as the theme for this presentation. And I will let him take over in a minute, but before we get there, I have to say just a couple more things. This is the fifth event of our 7-part speaker series that we do every year. Our next event takes place April 14th at 5 p.m. And the reason for that is that the person is coming to Zoom from the Midwest. And the title is Storytelling, Stepping from the Past to the Future with Indigenous Fantasy with Valerie Janice. She's a Ojibwe author and librarian, shares the creative process of entwining her traditional culture and the Ojibwe and Lakota languages with the supernatural and mythical beasts. And I will also put a link in. Give me a minute, do it after all my stuff. Okay, now I'm going to take a minute here and read the land acknowledgement, which is our tradition at Southern Oregon University, to take a moment to acknowledge our connection to this land, its history, and its present. The following is the formal land acknowledgement written by the members of the Native American Studies program here at SOU. We want to take this moment to acknowledge that Southern Oregon University is located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takelma, and Latgawa peoples who lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland and reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Takelma, Shasta, and Latgawa peoples of this area. We truly encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous people. Okay, so, and before I turn this over to Irv, I'm just going to mention this event is being recorded. because it's a Zoom webinar rather than a regular Zoom, you will not be able to see yourself, and you will be muted during the presentation, talking to all you audience here. We have the chat feature disabled, but the Q&A feature is available, and I will read any questions at the end. And actually, for this speaker, we're going to have 3 different question and answer periods. So just be aware, you don't have to save it all the way to the very end. You'll have a chance to jump in. If you're having any technical difficulties, you can email the tech help link found in the registration email. Many thanks to Erica Knotts for running this webinar from behind the scenes. And that's it. Without further ado, Irv Lubliner.
Thank you, Sophia, and thank you to all of you who have carved out this time to spend with me, to hear my words about my mother's words, giving me an opportunity to share with you what she wanted to share with all of us. And it really is very meaningful for me, having worked at SOU for the last 9 years of my 40-year teaching career. It really is a very special opportunity for me to be able to share with the SOU community, which is and always will be dear to me. I want to begin this presentation by sharing some PowerPoint slides with you that will introduce you to my mother, and you'll come to learn how it came to be that I published her stories. And so it takes me a moment here just to transfer over to my iPad, which has this PowerPoint, and now I believe you are seeing it. The book that I published is called Only Hope, A Survivor's Stories of the Holocaust, and I subtitled this presentation, My Mother and the Holocaust Brought to Light. As Sophia mentioned, I am Professor Emeritus at SOU, but my field had nothing to do with the Holocaust, nothing to do with history. My field was mathematics education, training the next generation of teachers who will be teaching mathematics in their classrooms, mostly elementary teachers for whom mathematics is an important component of the work they do. So that was my role within the math department. I also taught a few graduate level classes in the School of Education. Since retiring, I did publish my mother's book, created a publishing company, Falabra Press, and there in the bottom right corner, you see the URL for the book's website, onlyhopebook.com. This is the Bornstein family, my mother's family. My mother grew up in a small town in Poland called Pabianice. And in this photograph of the whole family together, there was one person who survived the Holocaust. Everybody else was murdered during the Holocaust. The one survivor was my mother, Felicia, in the upper right corner. My grandparents, I never met them, of course, and I never even knew their names or what my grandfather did for a living or if my grandmother did anything besides work within the home. I really had no knowledge about them for reasons I'll share with you shortly. My great-grandmother lived with the family, and everybody else you see in this photograph would have been an uncle or an aunt to me had they lived, a brother or sister to my mother. I'm guessing that my mother is about 16 here. Maybe she's just turned 17. It can't be any later than that because it was at about that time that the family got torn apart as certain members of the family were taken away at gunpoint or with bayonets pointed at them. They were marched out of their dwelling, whether it was in their home or in a ghetto, and never seen again. So the family being together here kind of helps me date this photograph. My mother tells her stories from the perspective of a Jew growing up in Poland, but I want to acknowledge that there were so many non-Jews who suffered as well. There were people who just spoke out against what the Nazis were trying to do and paid dearly for being so outspoken. There were gays and lesbians who were tortured, who were killed, whose lives were also miserable. There were people known as Roma or Gypsies whose lives were miserable. There were people who were trying to protect their friends who may have fallen under one of these umbrellas. Perhaps they had Jewish friends and they were trying to protect them, and then they got caught and they paid for that with their lives. People with handicaps were often killed, and just their lives were no longer valued. And so many people with handicaps of one kind or another were put to death. But my mother tells her story from the perspective of a Polish Jew. One of the first things that happened is something that unfortunately is happening in the world today all too often, and that is a prevalence of hate speech directed at Jews and other people. And unfortunately, there's a lot of hate speech in the world today. We often see or hear hate speech directed at people of color, and a Jew is not necessarily going to look different than anybody else. And it was important to the Nazis that people can distinguish the Jew when they saw him or her on the street. And so Jews were forced to wear a yellow star prominently on their clothing. If they were caught out and about without it, they might lose their life on the spot. And so people complied with that order to wear the yellow star. And that yellow star really told everybody who saw you that they could treat you as the other, that they could mistreat you, that they could rob you, steal from you, beat you, break into your dwelling. Just about anything they wished to do, they could do it and know that there was going to be no punishment for doing it. It was basically a sign that you were not a first or second class citizen. You were third, fourth, or might even be viewed as subhuman, as a lot of that hate speech spouted off about Jews being subhuman and not worthy of even living. And the Jews who were subjected to this treatment had to wonder, could this get any worse? And of course, in time, it does get much worse. At one point, somebody knocked on the door or burst through the door and ordered my mother's family out of the house and was told to take what they could carry and that they were now going to be living in the ghetto. In the context of rap music today, a ghetto might refer to the poor side of town. But in the context of the Holocaust, ghetto means you're behind barbed wire. There might be 10 people sharing a room, maybe 3 families sharing a room. And that room or that dwelling that has many, many families in it, far too many than it was built for, may or may not have running water. It may or may not have electricity. You certainly don't have the things you need to maintain your daily comforts. And so you're begging, you're borrowing, and you're stealing to get through each and every day. You only leave the barbed wire area with permission, perhaps to go do some assigned work for which you get paid very meager amount of money or perhaps a loaf of bread or something like that. But this is a really, really bad existence. And people, again, are wondering, could this get any worse? And of course, it does. My mother grew up in the little town of Pabianica. She did not know my father, but he was close by, having grown up in Lodz, 2 towns kind of like Ashland and Grants Pass, perhaps, or Ashland and Medford even, very close together. And they did not know each other, and both of them were, with their families, kicked out of their homes and sent to their respective ghettos, the Pabianica ghetto, the Lodz ghetto. Eventually, the Nazis liquidated the Pabianica ghetto, and all the people there were sent elsewhere. My mother was sent to the Lodz ghetto. Together with her mother, her father had already been taken away and she never saw him again. So for some matter of months, both my mother and my father lived in the Lodz ghetto. They still did not know each other. It was a very large ghetto, over 100,000 people confined to it. So there's a lot of opportunity to have 2 people there not know each other, and they did not know each other. And they still did not know each other when, in separate transports, they were both sent to Auschwitz. Auschwitz is the best known of all the concentration camps, and one reason that so much is known about it and so little about some of the other camps is that some of the other camps were nothing more than death camps. People would get off the train, would be immediately marched to either a pit, and they would be shot and they would fall into the pit, or they would be gassed within an hour or so of getting off the train and never seen again. And if it was a death camp, there were just so few people who would survive such a thing that there were not people who could tell the story of what took place there. Auschwitz was sort of a multi-purpose camp. For most, it was a death camp. But there was a minority of people there who, having gotten off the train and gone through a selection process where somebody would order people, you go to the left, you go to the right, to the left, to the right, to the right, to the left, etc. There would be a group of people who'd be marched to barracks, and they didn't know what was going to happen next. And either they would just wait until their work was needed somewhere, or at least in the Nazis' eyes, needed, um, or they might be put to work there at Auschwitz. So it was a work camp, a slave labor camp, as well as a death camp. And as a result, some people survived and were able to tell the story of what took place there. And that's one reason that Auschwitz is better known than the other camps. Both my parents survived longer than was typical. If you were spared an instant death when you got off the train, then you had a life expectancy of about 2 months at Auschwitz because of malnutrition, because of freezing, because of the capricious acts of the guards. For one reason or another, it was just so easy to lose one's life at Auschwitz. So you had a life expectancy of about 2 months. Both of my parents lived in Auschwitz longer than that and were ultimately sent elsewhere. My mother to a camp called Gross Rosen, my father to a camp called Bergen-Belsen, which was west of this map, and thus you don't see its exact location here. Most of what I will share with you tonight is from the perspective of my mother, because she was more outspoken about her experiences than my father, much more outspoken. But I do want to mention Bergen-Belsen a bit and just give you a sense of what my father endured. There was a sign posted by the British liberators at Bergen-Belsen that kind of tells the story. When they arrived, they found 10,000 unburied dead bodies. So just imagine, that's approximately half the population of Ashland. Just imagine that many dead bodies just lying around on the grounds. Then they set up hospitals to try to care for those who were barely clinging to life. And in the weeks that followed, another 13,000 of those people died. They were so close to death already that they didn't make it. And these were all victims of the German New Order in Europe, an example of Nazi culture. So my father was among those who lived, but at the time he was liberated, he weighed about 80 pounds. He was about my height, and I weigh about 180 pounds. So I can only imagine just how close to death he was, having been starved and just not cared for medically, but somehow they brought him back to life. This is the well-known gate at Auschwitz, and some of the other camps had such a gate, and the inscription reads, Arbeit macht frei, work sets you free. And this was part of a grand deception. The idea was to have people get off the train and have a sense of, well, we are prisoners, but you see, they're going to put us to work. And so they must feed us because the sign says we're going to be working here. And this was, as I say, a grand deception because so many of them were marched immediately to their death. And there was really no way work was going to set anybody free. My mother describes many things happening in Auschwitz in groups of 5. So imagine this bunk here with no mattress, maybe a little bit of straw on it, but maybe not, maybe just wooden slats. And you see 3 women occupying that bunk, but you might have as many as 5 occupying that space. And if they have a blanket, it's one blanket that they're sharing among the 5, or in this case, the 3. If one of them wants to turn, then they all have to move accordingly to adjust for that one person's desire to move around. If one person has lice, chances are they're all going to get it, not just the ones within that bunk, but the whole barracks are likely to get lice. If one person has a disease, they're all likely to get it. When they're woken up in the morning and they go out for the roll call, it's bitter cold. They're in groups of 5. They might be told to stand in the ankle-deep mud. They might have to kneel in the ankle-deep mud for hours while thousands of people are counted. The dead bodies also brought out and just put into heaps, groups of 5 for easy counting. Feeding in groups of 5. You might have a pail of really watery soup presented to a group of 5. There's no spoons, there's no forks. You're drinking out of the pail, and 4 other people are watching every sip you take to make sure that you don't overdo it because they want their share. If you get a little loaf of bread, it's for the 5 of you, and you have to find a way to split it. So it's a miserable, miserable existence in every single way. But my mother survived it. And this is a picture of my mother about 7 months after her liberation. And I had no idea where this picture was taken until very recently. The way I got this photo was from this movie, The Long Way Home, which was the Oscar winner for Best Documentary in 1997. And it was about people who were released from the concentration camps and had no homes to go to, and were hoping that Palestine, then under British control, would take more people in, and that the US would take more people in, and that South American nations would take more people in, and China took some people in. And all of them were hoping that the quotas that each of these countries had set would be increased to allow more of them to emigrate to these countries. So this movie is about having no place to go and just waiting it out in refugee camps. And about 10 minutes before the end of the movie, there's my mom on the screen for about 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, she blinks. So I contacted the filmmaker and I asked, you've got movie footage of my mother. She blinks. Can I get the rest of this footage? And the filmmaker explained to me that not only was there not more footage, there was only 1 second of footage, which they showed every frame twice in order to stretch it out for a 2 second period, because they felt like my mother's face had a look in her eyes, is what they talked about. They said her eyes expressed the grief of the past, but a hope for the future. And it was with that in mind, they wanted to get my mother's image into the movie. But as I say, she blinks, and I had no idea where this was taken. And only a week ago, somebody sent me a video of people demonstrating in December of 1945 in Frankfurt, Germany, with signs like protesters would carry, signs that said, US, please let more people in. Britain, please let more people into Palestine. And my mother is there at that demonstration, and the same second of footage that was in the movie was in this video that I saw on YouTube a few days ago. And now I know exactly where this picture came from. My mother lost all 8 of her siblings, but my father had a brother who survived the Holocaust. I knew him as Uncle David, and David also survived the camps, and he was in much better health than my father. My father really required a lot of medical care. So my uncle made inquiries through agencies like the Red Cross and found out that his brother, my dad, Abram, was still alive. And so he traveled to the refugee camp where my father was and announced, I'm here to see my brother, Abram Lubliner. And they pointed to my dad and said, well, he's sitting right over there. And my uncle said, that is not my brother. And they said, well, he answers to the name Abram Lubliner, so you might want to go talk to him. And so my uncle approached my dad. Neither one of them recognized the other until they started sharing childhood stories, and then they realized that they were indeed brothers. But the whole experience of the Holocaust had changed their appearance so much, neither recognized the other. My uncle was engaged to be married. His fiancée was Helen. Later, you'll hear about a Helen on my mother's side of the family. But Helen was my uncle's fiancée, and she met my father, and she said to my dad, I know a woman from my town, Pabianica, who survived. I think you'd like her. You should meet her. And so she played matchmaker, brought my parents together. They fell in love and got married while still in Europe. My parents came over to the US because of the Helen on my mother's side of the family. My mother had an Aunt Helen who was born and raised in Poland, but had left before the Holocaust and made her way to Oakland, California. So my mother, when she was liberated and married and had my older brother Joseph by then, reached out to her Aunt Helen. Helen said, come to the US, come to Oakland, California, and I will watch out for you. So my parents got off this boat in New Orleans and made their way across the country to Oakland, California, where I was born and raised. My mother died in 1974, my father in 1980, and I was prepared because they were both quite sick, and I was prepared to lose them. What I wasn't prepared for is that out of the blue, I lost my brother when I was 29 and he was 35. I miss him so much, and if he were alive, he'd probably correct some of my fuzzy memories about my parents. And unfortunately, now that my parents have been gone for so long, some of those memories are quite fuzzy, but I'm doing my best to kind of bring back what I can. My parents tried very hard to give us the most normal American kid upbringing they could. There was no effort to get us to speak their native language, Polish or Yiddish, that they were also very comfortable in. My father could also communicate in German, Hungarian, Czech, Russian. English was probably the language with which he was least confident, though you would have no trouble understanding him. But he never developed the kind of fluency with the language that my mother did. She eventually became a public speaker speaker and a writer in English. But they did not want us to think of ourselves as European kids. They wanted us to be American kids. So our lives included music lessons and sports at school and Cub Scouts and then Boy Scouts and activities at the recreation center and such. They wanted us to think of ourselves as American kids. And that meant we weren't speaking about the Holocaust. That's not to say they were unwilling to speak about the Holocaust. If I asked a question like, why do you have a tattoo on your arm, each of you, with a number on it, they would explain that they were prisoners during the war and their captors tattooed them with a number. And if I asked, why don't I have grandparents, they would explain that my grandparents died during the war. But I sensed there was a lot of grief associated with them answering my questions. And so my tendency was to stop asking questions. So I learned very little as a result, and I regret that now. Every year I saw my parents light a memorial candle, a Yizkor candle as it's called in Hebrew, in memory of those who were lost. But the prayers were said in Hebrew, and there was not a follow-up in English that I could understand where the actual names of the people were shared with me. And I really had no sense of how large my mother's family was or who exactly these people were who were lost. I did know that my mother was writing and speaking to other people, people older than me. As a little 9 or 10-year-old kid, I wasn't paying much attention. But my mother might mention at the dinner table one day, oh, I spoke at San Francisco State today to that class studying the Holocaust. Or I might hear late at night tap, tap, tap on the typewriter. And if I came downstairs, I would see that she had been writing in English about the Holocaust. And I knew that because I was seeing words like Nazi, concentration camp, Auschwitz, things like that. So I was aware that she was sharing her experiences with people older than me, but being a little kid and with all my childhood interests, I just wasn't paying close attention. I had no idea the quality of her writing was so strong. May of 1961, I was 9 years old, actually 8 years old. I was going to turn 9 later in May. And one of her stories, this is 12 years after she comes to this country not knowing English. And so within that 12-year period, she mastered the language to the point where she is writing in English, she's speaking publicly in English, and the first of her stories gets published in the San Francisco Chronicle in May of 1961. And I still own a copy of that particular newspaper from 1961. But as I said, we were not talking about the Holocaust. My mother tried very hard not to be defined by the Holocaust. She wanted a life. She sort of wanted to turn the page and say, I will address the Holocaust with certain audiences, but the people who see me on the street or the people who see me at work are not going to know that I'm a Holocaust survivor. So she was really determined to turn the page and create a new life for herself. She was very outgoing. This is a picture of my mother when I was in elementary school performing in the school's parent talent show. The PTA every year would have a talent show, and they would typically have groups of 4 or 5 parents who would get together and perform a little skit, or maybe 4 of them would be a barbershop quartet, and they would turn to my parents and say, what will you do in the talent show? And my dad would say, just give me as few spoken lines as possible and I'll get up there and be in somebody's skit. And my mother would say, just give me a time slot and I'll get up there by myself and I will do something funny. And it was kind of like Zsa Zsa Gabor. She would get up there, do something very funny. We were all laughing. It appeared she was laughing, but I've come to realize the extent to which she was crying on the inside while laughing on the outside. That same year that story was published in the San Francisco Chronicle, here's evidence that she was still trying to improve her writing skills, as she had signed up at the community college in Oakland for a creative writing class and an alternate in case she couldn't get into that one that same year, November of 1961. My mother was a travel agent. When she no longer had to be at home when I came home from school, when I was old enough that I could come home to an empty house, she decided she wanted to work outside the home, no longer working as a seamstress within the home, and she became Northern California's foremost travel agent for travel to Israel. She knew Israel travel backwards and forwards and eventually led trips to Israel herself. So here's my mom about to board the plane with all these people who are going to go to Israel under her guidance and tour the country. And her dear friend Rena on the right, who they would get together a few times a week and play Scrabble. And I remember in college, I once tried to play my mother in Scrabble and she just wiped me out. And for me, it was my first language. For her, probably her third or fourth language. And she was just an incredible Scrabble player. This is my mother shortly before she passed away. I was a senior at UC Berkeley, and Berkeley and Oakland, as you may know, are right next to each other. So I was not far from home. But if I came home to have dinner with my folks, it was to talk about how school was going for me, or I was working in a movie theater and they might ask, how's your job at the theater? But we certainly weren't using those opportunities to talk about the Holocaust. And when my mother was diagnosed with terminal cancer and we realized she only had a few months to live, that would have been my opportunity to say, Mom, before you die, I want to hear about the Holocaust. But I sensed that she was in enough pain from the cancer. She was very groggy from the morphine and other drugs she was taking. And I just sensed this is going to dredge up even more pain for her. And I did not bring it up. And so I learned so little about the Holocaust, and much of it later from reading her stories. When I went off to graduate school at UC Davis, I was getting phone calls from people as I was approaching the end of my graduate studies. I started to get calls from people saying, you need to come home and take care of your dad. He's showing signs of senility. And at that point, the world had not yet heard of Alzheimer's dementia. But I went down to the Bay Area during one of my vacations and had my father seen by a neurologist. And the neurologist explained, well, your father has this thing that we're diagnosing now called Alzheimer's disease. He was the first person I ever heard of who had it. And so as soon as I finished graduate school, I moved back in with my father and tried to care for him at home. And that meant it became my responsibility to go through the family's belongings and decide what gets kept and what do we get rid of. And among the things I found were my mother's writings. Crafted stories, crafted in the sense that I would find multiple drafts of the same story and they weren't dated. So I had to decide if one of these drafts is going to be carried forward and shared with other people, which one seems the most polished. And I also found this handwritten essay that when I created the compilation and published it, I made that essay the introduction to the other crafted stories that had been typewritten and for which multiple drafts had been written. I also inherited reel-to-reel tapes of my mother's presentations at San Francisco State, as well as a recorded interview that played on KGO radio down in the Bay Area. So I inherited these, had them transcribed, and had them transferred to files that I can keep on my computer. I can carry her voice with me on my phone. And my presentation this evening will actually end with some of my mother's words in her own voice as she spoke those words in 1967, speaking at San Francisco State. So having inherited these stories, I started to share them in school classrooms, mostly middle and high school classrooms, the occasional college classroom. And after sharing them in middle or high school classrooms, I would often hear from the parents saying, my child came home from school and talked about how impacting these stories were. Could I borrow the stories and read them myself? And I would get the same response from parents that I had been getting from the teachers and the students, which was, you need to get these published. These stories are too impacting, too well written. You need to help these find a bigger audience. And so that became a goal of mine about 25 years ago. I spoke at a school called Bentley School down in Oakland, California, and one of the 8th grade students wrote this. Your mother's stories really put me in her shoes, and I saw what she and others were going through. She was a wonderful author and a great storyteller. Thank you for sharing the stories with us, and I hope you continue to pass them on to educate people on how painful the Holocaust experience was. When I moved with my wife to Ashland in 2005, I met Betsy Bishop, who teaches at Ashland High School. And Betsy has had me in to visit her class, or in the last 2 years, visit with Zoom for about 10 years in a row now. I'm going to visit her class next week. And Betsy wrote the following: how powerful these stories are. Your mother was a very insightful woman. My class has never been so respectful and quiet. And Betsy is currently teaching English as well as drama at the high school. And she just purchased a class set of my mother's book because she feels that these are worthy examples of how to craft a short story. And they also teach important history lessons as well. So I'm honored that Betsy decided to use these as a resource in her class and that she now has a whole class set. She informed me today that I don't need to come in and read the stories this year. Every student in the class has read the entire book. They just want to ask me questions when I visit next week. So this isn't me, but it reminds me of me during all those years when I was trying to contribute something to what would become a book. I felt like I'm the child of two Holocaust survivors. I should have something to say about my own experience, but I couldn't find my own voice. I couldn't determine what it was I really wanted to say and find the words with which to express it. But in 2014, after 9 years at SOU, I retired from formal teaching, the kind where you're grading papers and evaluating students and such. And I started teaching at Ollie, where people are there because they wish to be. They're not trying to meet degree requirements. And it's a different kind of experience, but it allows me to keep teaching because it's in my blood to keep doing that. I love it. But in 2014, my wife and I had a conversation about, now that I've retired, what is left to do in our lives that's really important. And for me, at the top of that list, it was publishing my mother's stories. That is what is most important. And I realized that it was time for me to get some help. So I hired a writing coach. Now, some people hire a writing coach to ghostwrite something for them. Everything that appears in the book, I wrote myself. But the coach helped me by giving me some prompts and said, why don't you start a page with these words and see where it takes you? So I would generate pages and pages in response to these prompts and add them to the collection of all the pages I had written in previous years, as I had many, many previous attempts to generate a foreword or an afterword, something that would complement my mother's stories. I eventually put it all in the hands of somebody else I met through our local Ollie program, somebody who teaches a class on writing your memoirs. I asked him to look it over and help me decide what that I've written is worth keeping and what should I just not use. And he helped me make some choices about what would and would not get into the book. At some point, I know I need to go back and read all the stuff that didn't get in the book because I know it was very therapeutic for me to have written it. And so one day soon, I need to go back and read it all. I got a lot more feedback, some of which was, don't share all of this prior to people reading the story. Save some of it for the end as an afterword. And I chose to do that. That was useful feedback. And then I felt ready to move forward with publishing the book. So in honor of my parents, Felicia, whose nickname was Fela, and my father, Abram, I created Falabra Press. And the name was chosen to honor them. Falabra Press has one publication, and it is this book, Only Hope, A Survivor's Stories of the Holocaust. It is my mother's book, not mine, though I contributed to it in the ways you see at the bottom. And some people see the words edited by and they assume that I had to edit my mother's writing. My mother's writing was polished enough that it did not need me to tinker with it. My editorial decisions were things like, in what order should these stories be placed within the book? I decided to put a transcript from San Francisco State between two of the stories because it created sort of chronological continuity from life in the ghetto to the transport to the concentration camp in a cattle car that my mother never wrote about, but she spoke about it. So I put that transcript next. And then through one of her stories describing her first day in Auschwitz. I also made some decisions about what would be in the appendix. There's a glossary for teachers using it in their classrooms and such. I made some editorial decisions, but it is my mother's book. So I want to end this PowerPoint with just one more slide of my mother. Had she not been willing to go back and look at her experience and reflect on it, there would be no book and no presentation for me to give to you this evening. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point and just ask Sophia to tell me, are there any chat questions that have come in? And if any of you have questions, please feel free to enter them in the chat, and don't feel like anything is off limits here, because I really want to answer each and every question that comes in. Sophia, are there any at this point?
There are no questions at the moment. We can
All right.
remind people that you don't have to ask a great question.
Right. Any question is just fine. So, since there are none at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sharing some excerpts from the book, and I will stop from time to time and see if any questions have come in. So, don't hesitate to enter your questions, and we'll see how many there are next time I take a break. I'm going to make you wait a bit to hear my mother's powerful writing, as I want to share with you a bit of my own. This is the beginning of my foreword, and I want to share enough of it with you to help you understand how differently my mother and my father handled their experiences. They were both survivors of very similar experiences, and yet they handled it very differently. And I also want to read to you enough of the foreword to explain where this title came from, Only Hope. So this is the beginning of my foreword. My mother wrote, my father spit. My mother talked, my father spit. My mother told her stories to anyone who would listen. My father spit. My mother wanted to share her Holocaust experiences with you, and she did so by writing the stories that you hold in your hand. My father kept his own experiences locked up tight within himself, and then he spit. Both of them were deeply affected by what they suffered in their teens and 20s. It is baffling to me how they were able to live what those around them, those who didn't know any better, would call normal lives. My mother's way of processing and integrating her experiences was to get close to people and then share her deepest secrets, letting them feel her pain. My father kept his pain locked up within almost until the end of his life. Shortly after my mother's death, my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I tried caring for him at home. He had always enjoyed stamp collecting, and someone had given him a bag of European stamps from the 30s and 40s. He hardly ever talked at this point, but he was very content to examine and sort the stamps. One night, he was looking over his stamps one by one as I graded papers. All of a sudden, he became quite agitated. Looking in his direction, I saw the one in his hand bearing a picture of Hitler, and if I remember correctly, a swastika. Without saying a word, my father angrily spit on that stamp. My father did not, as a rule, call attention to himself, and I had never seen him spit. He was also not one to ask others to focus on what he endured and lost as a young adult. He might have fooled those who knew him into thinking that his experiences of the Holocaust were behind him or forgotten. In that moment, however, his spitting left no doubt that his grief and anger had always been there, hidden. Witnessing that, I could tell that his stories were every bit as powerful as my mother's, if only he had chosen or been able to share them. As I think about my parents' experiences in the Nazi concentration camps, I wonder what kept them going. With too little food, death all around them, savage beatings doled out to those not doing their assigned slave labor quickly enough, and the loss of all that had once been dear to them, what could they do to summon the will to live another day? The only answer that comes to me is they could hope. With shattered dreams, interrupted educations, no homes or family to which they might someday return, and a horrifying day-to-day existence, they could not make plans for their futures. They could only hope. Would each day's meager food ration provide enough sustenance to stay alive until tomorrow? Would the doctor making the selections of who should live and who should die allow them another day's salvation? If yesterday they were lucky to avoid being singled out by a capricious and malicious guard, would that luck last through another day? They could only hope. Would the torn rags that had to suffice as clothing provide enough warmth at night to avoid freezing to death? Would the diseases that ran rampant throughout the camps, taking many lives, spare theirs? They could only hope. My mother, Felicia Lubliner, died in 1974, but she lives on in the pages you are about to read. She also lives on in the hearts and minds of the many people who have read and been impacted by her stories. You are about to enter her world, and I am confident you will be grateful that you decided to go there. The rest of the foreword is an introduction to my mother, similar to what I tried to convey with PowerPoint this evening for somebody who needs to read it rather than view a video presentation, explaining my mother's early life, how it came to be that I inherited her stories, etc. I'm now going to skip to that handwritten essay that I showed you in a photograph. And I have no idea how my mother intended to use it. Maybe it was going to become a typewritten essay. Maybe it was going to be orally delivered in one of her presentations. I felt even in its crude form that I found it, it merited inclusion in the book, and it serves as the introduction. Its title is Follow Me into Auschwitz. And I'm reminded of the few times that I've spoken to actors at our Shakespeare Festival here, and they talk about the importance of an audience, how different it is to perform to an audience. And they said many people in the audience don't realize the importance of their being there. And each performance is an invitation to the audience. Come along and take this journey with us, the actors. And my mother, in her words, is extending that same kind of invitation. Come along with me into Auschwitz. Follow me and have this experience if you're willing. And so you're going to notice there's a lot of the use of the word you. And I hope that you'll realize she's directing that not just at me, but at you. And I'm going to pick it up towards the end of this essay. Follow me into Auschwitz. What would you have done if it were your freedom and your life that were being threatened by the Nazis? What if it were your parents, your children, your brothers and sisters, and your dearest friends that were being taken away, never to be seen again? Would you have fought the Nazis with your bare hands? Would you have chosen to die by your own hand rather than let yourself be driven to the gas chambers? Accusations have been made that Jews behaved cowardly and let themselves be slaughtered by the millions without resistance. This is not true. There was resistance, not only desperate, armed, and heroic, as in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, but day-by-day resistance and a will to withstand, to outlive. Death was cheap at Auschwitz. It was ever present, stinking its way into your very brain, blackening the sky with its smoke, looking at you from the barrels of guns and from the eyes of the condemned. Death was with you during the dreaded roll calls, where at dawn and dusk you stood for endless hours in ankle-deep mud, with only rags between you and the biting chill of the wind. It was easy to die at Auschwitz. One did not have to be a hero to die. There were many ways you could have saved the SS the work. All you had to do was give up. Give up willingly the spark of life still flickering in you, that last thing you had, which they were so determined to take. You could have risked your own life and tried to attack an SS guard, as has been suggested by Dr. Bruno Bettelheim in his book, The Informed Heart. This, even if it were possible, would have been not only a foolish way to commit suicide, but it would have been murder as well. For by your so-called heroism, you would have exposed your next of kin, your loved ones, and the rest of your fellow inmates to the uncontrollable fury of SS revenge. It was easier to just touch the electrified wires crisscrossing the campsite and end it all. The temptation was always there. It was hardest to resist at night. The wires stretched as far as you could see, with the lights strung on them and the wind playing a weird invitation to death. Touch me. Come close. Touch me. It took great strength to resist, but we resisted. I resisted the temptation. Dying makes sense if one has a cause to die for. We had no such cause. We had a great cause to live. By my own death, I could not possibly have saved anybody nor accomplished anything. It would have been a futile gesture and an easy way out, and it would have proved that deep in my heart I believed that Auschwitz is forever. It would have meant admitting to myself that this screaming, insane world around me represented the universe. I chose to live. For every hour lived at Auschwitz was a victory, and if I had lost in the end, I would be marching to meet death, along with the others, without tears, without dramatic outbursts, but in a silence that shrieked, its mute protest into the unheeding heavens and a deaf world. The world was not prepared for Auschwitz. It was, in fact, a place unbelievable even for its inmates. No words can really adequately describe this weird world, unlike anything mankind had ever known. In order to understand its implication, you actually had to be part of it. I'll have to be autobiographical, but follow me, if you will, into Auschwitz and spend a day there and meet some of the people in the nameless mass of bodies. Try, if you will, to feel, even for a moment, that you could have been one of them, that in fact you were one of them. And that is the end of that essay that I don't know how she was going to use it. But I view it as an invitation. Come take this journey and read the rest of these stories. I certainly don't have time to read to you from each of the stories, so I'm going to kind of do a quick tour through the book and give you a sense of what some of these stories are about. What
Eric,
follows, yes,
sorry, would you like to answer some questions? We have about four right now.
yes. Let's do that. Go ahead.
Okay. One of them is, do you feel you and your brother inherited any of your parents' trauma? If so, how has it manifested in your life?
I certainly did. I believe my brother probably did as well. One way that I've come to recognize it in my own adult life is to realize the role that fear has played in my life. If somebody suggests, "Hey, Irv, let's go do such and such," instead of going, "Yeah, that's going to be great," I'm the one who kind of goes, "Wait a minute, have we really thought this through from every angle? Let's think about everything that could go wrong." So I think my first impulse, given a new situation, is to look at it fearfully, and I've had to work on that as an adult. So I think that I grew up with this sense of my parents lost it all at a young age. I could lose it all. I better just save money, not spend it, because you never have enough, and you've got to kind of have some in this account and have some in that account. It was just kind of this overprotectiveness of myself and my safety that I feel I inherited as a result of knowing what my parents went through. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. It's probably affected me in other ways as well.
Yeah.
This sense of just that I could lose the loved ones in my life at any moment, that everything is so precious, and just a little bit more fear that I could lose it all at any moment. So thank you to whoever asked that question, and please pass on the next question to me, Sophia.
Okay, great. We have two questions from the same person, and one of them was, can you tell us a bit about your mother's stories, which I think you're getting into that.
I'm getting into that now.
Yeah,
Yes,
we'll
for
let
sure.
that go. And then quickly they asked, can we purchase the book from Bloomsbury?
Yes,
Bloomsbury book.
Bloomsbury
Yes.
has copies,
Okay.
and
Is
there is
it the link?
one copy at the Hannon Library, and I think two copies at the Ashland Library, and one copy in Grants Pass in their library, and so various libraries have it. So yes, you can purchase it at Bloomsbury, and I support you supporting our local bookstore. You can also go to the book's website, which is onlyhopebook.com, and make a purchase directly from the website. Just within the last few months, I created a Kindle version, which it was marketed by Amazon, and only about 10 days ago did I actually turn the whole thing over to Amazon. So yes, I've got copies and I make them available through the website, but Amazon can also print books on demand now. So it is available from a lot of sources, including all those I mentioned. So yes, support Bloomsbury, and they do have the book.
Okay, great. Okay, so then we have, any comments on life in Poland just today?
Wow. If it wasn't for COVID and it wasn't for the political situation going on in Europe right now, I would probably travel to Poland this July. I was invited to go on a tour that's being sponsored by a Holocaust museum in Terre Haute, Indiana. In about 10 days, I am flying to Terre Haute to be one of two keynote speakers at a conference that they're holding. And they asked me if I wanted to go on this tour that they're having. Whether they're going to cancel the tour is still up in the air. I have a feeling it will get canceled because of what's going on. All I can do is sympathize with all that's going on there. It's a dreadful, dreadful situation. And I am a member of several Facebook groups, things like Holocaust Educators of America, Holocaust Resources for Teachers. I'm a member of a number of these Remember the Holocaust kinds of groups. And some people are just not forgiving at all, saying, I can't forgive the Ukrainians for what they did to the Jewish people. They were complicit, and I will never let them off the hook for that. And I cannot show them any sympathy. Personally, I feel like I have no gripe against the people of Ukraine today, and I feel so bad for what they're going through. But I also feel bad for what Asians are going through in this country, and they're just people of color and gays and lesbians and what they're going through in this country. I mean, there's just so much hate being spewed by so many people in the world right now that there's just not enough sympathy to go around. But right now, it's especially bad in Ukraine. And all I can do is sympathize and try to support causes that will support those people in what they're going through. And I will mention that on my wife's family, her family comes from Lithuania. We have reached out to her Lithuanian cousins saying, if you want to send your kids to America, they can live with us. So that's the extent to which we are concerned that what is now in Ukraine could spread to the Baltic states and affect my wife's family there.
Yeah, good point. Well, we just have to get some love out there, right?
We
We have
do indeed.
one more question. Tell us where you were after UC Davis and what brought you to Ashland.
Oh, okay. I was teaching. I was teaching younger learners for most of my career. So I was teaching in the Oakland, Berkeley, and Marin County area, three different schools, Oakland, Berkeley, and Marin County, for 31 years, working with eighth grade and younger, primarily as a mathematics specialist. And I was doing workshops around the country for teachers of math at all grade levels. So I sort of developed this national following as a speaker at conferences nationwide. And then in 2005, my wife and I bought, or 2003, we bought a property in Ashland. We didn't know we'd ever move into it, but we came here and we were remodeling this property and not sure if we would sell it or whatever. And then I made it a point to meet educators, and I met the superintendent in Medford, and lo and behold, she offers me a job to come coach teachers in Medford. So I was a middle school coach of math teachers, and that job vanished after a year because of the budget crisis. And they said, we'd like all of our coaches to not want you wouldn't be instructional coaches anymore. You're going to be regular classroom teachers. And I said, that's what I've done for 31 years, classroom teaching. I'm going to look around and see where else I can mentor teachers. And I was in the right place at the right time, and SOU was looking for somebody to mentor the next generation of teachers. And based on my experience nationwide as a trainer of teachers, even though I don't possess a PhD, SOU offered me a professorship. And I'm probably one of the very few people who is now professor emeritus and yet has no PhD. But that's how that all came to be. A longer story than I intended to share about that. But I'll now get back to the book.
Yeah.
So what follows that handwritten essay is a biographical timeline of my mother's life, because people often ask for the relevant dates in her life. And then the first of the crafted stories is called A Package of Hope. And in a nutshell, A Package of Hope takes place when my mother's family is still in a ghetto, and a knock at the door was something you dreaded because it could be anything. But in this case, the knock at the door is a messenger with a note saying, present this note at the local postal office, and there's a package waiting for you from America. And so they pick up the package and they set it on the table. And even without opening it, they're just kind of in awe that my mother's Aunt Helen, the one who lived in Oakland, California, had sent this package to them, and it made it through all the red tape that it would take to get to them in the ghetto. And they're just staring at this thing, and it represents hope. And then they open it, and all the contents represent hope. And then the neighbors find out, and they drop by because they also want to get in on this hopeful energy represented by what my mother refers to as the package of hope. The next thing in the book is this presentation at San Francisco State, where my mother speaks about the transport from the ghetto to the concentration camp. So I'm going to skip over that. The next story is the one that was printed in the San Francisco Chronicle, called Concert at Auschwitz. And It's about her first day in Auschwitz, and really just doesn't know what to make of this whole experience. And people are barking orders at her and such. And one of the guards says, I know that one of you was a singer in the Warsaw Opera, and I want to hear you sing. So get up here and sing for me right now." And so this woman is ordered out of the group, and she needs to sing. And my mother juxtaposes the beauty of this woman singing and even the guard taking it in as just kind of this rhapsodizing about this beautiful music that's being sung. And the prisoners are crying because it's just so beautiful, but they look at the sky and the crematoria is billowing smoke, and the juxtaposition of the ugliness of that and then the beauty of what is being sung. And if I had more time, I would read you that story in its entirety, but I'm going to just read you the end, and I may be spoiling it, but sometimes I read this entire story to people, so it's certainly no more of a spoiler than that. But the last few paragraphs go like this. "A young woman was ordered out of the crowd of inmates. She still showed traces of beauty on her emaciated face in spite of her shaven head. Her naked body could be seen through the holes of her tattered garment. As she began to sing, Irma Gressa, who was the guard who ordered the woman out of the group, as she began to sing, Irma Gressa stood quietly, listening to the beautiful arias, Lieder, and folk songs which poured forth in an uninterrupted stream." A Lieder, by the way, is a particular kind of German song associated with the Romantic period. As she began to sing, Irma Gressa stood quietly, listening to the beautiful arias, Lieder, and folk songs which poured forth in an uninterrupted stream. The young woman sang of love, beauty, and peaceful nature, while outside the smokestacks of the crematoria billowed clouds of fire and smoke which covered the sky for miles. When I looked about me, I saw the effect of the beautiful music on my fellow inmates. They were motionless, but tears were streaming down their faces. I was amazed to see that they did have tears left, the memories of long forgotten days of happiness breaking through the despair of hopelessness. There was no applause. After the concert ended, Irma Gressa walked away quietly. On the way back to her quarters, she calmly shot a girl for raiding the garbage can in search of potato peelings. One of the things that really comes through in my mother's writing is just how easy it was to lose your life over the smallest little incident. You know, you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Somebody sees you doing something, they don't like what you're doing, and they shoot you for it, or they send you to the gas chamber for it. And in this case, this woman loses her life because she's raiding the garbage can. The next story is called The Legacy, and in The Legacy, we learn about two sisters who had made a pact. We will either live through this experience together or we will die together. If one of us is taken to the gas chambers, the other will volunteer to go along. And my mother introduces them by name. She wants us to get to know them as people, not just as numbers. And so it's very important to my mother that she tells some of their little personality quirks. And it tells the story of what happens when a guard challenges this pact and threatens to separate them, and the extremes that they will go through to try to stay together. And so that story is called The Legacy. The next of the stories is called Choose Your Weapons. And when we hear the word weapon, we tend to think of a club, a knife, a gun, something you use to do bodily harm. But a weapon can be used to hurt somebody in ways that aren't bodily harm. And in this story, Choose Your Weapons, we have two prisoners who have very, very different circumstances. One of them is your lowly prisoner with no power whatsoever, whereas the other one is a prisoner with special privileges, maybe extra food, extra clothing, maybe an exemption from work, a prisoner with a lot of power designated as a capo. Capos were given special considerations in exchange for doing the dirty work a guard might not want to do. So a capo might be given a whip and say, whip your fellow prisoners if they're not working fast enough. And if the capo said, I can't do that, these are my fellow prisoners, the guard would say, okay, then I'm cutting off the special food. I'm no longer going to protect your family. You should have thought twice about this. I'll get somebody else to do this dirty work. So in this story, there are two prisoners of very different circumstances, and the one is being really tormented by the one with a lot of power because of some incident that caused the one with the power to take it out on the one who has no power, Otto and David. David finds a way to fight back, and everybody wonders what is keeping David going day after day. He's being abused in such extreme ways. How does he get up each morning and just face it for another day? And it turns out David has some kind of a scheme going on the side that is his weapon, that is sort of keeping him going, and we learn about that in that story, Choose Your Weapons. My parents, by the way, both had their own weapons as well. It came to light years later. I found some documentation, and it's in the book, about what my parents were doing to sabotage the slave labor that they were assigned to do. So they were both producing certain things that would be used by the Nazis later on, and they were in for some surprises because my parents both, at great risk to themselves, were doing their assigned slave labor in ways that they weren't supposed to be doing it, and creating some surprises down the road. There's a story called The Choice. And in The Choice, my mother describes waking up, not in Auschwitz. By then, she's in a different camp, Gross Rosen. And she wakes up one morning and the guards have fled. Sensing that the Russian army was approaching and would probably be there soon, the guards flee. And that creates an opportunity for the prisoners of different nationalities that had been kept separate, as well as the men and women being kept separate, to now get together. And so the French prisoners who'd been allowed to keep their musical instruments come bringing accordions and harmonicas, and they're playing music, and people are singing in multiple languages, and they're dancing, and they go raid the kitchen, and they're enjoying food and sugar and things that they've not had for years. And it's, for want of a better word, I'll say it's a party atmosphere, though some people they were too weak to even involve themselves in it. But for those strong enough, it's kind of like a party. And it remains that way until a group comes back and say, look what we found. We found this female guard hiding. What should we do with her? And it becomes the group's decision to decide what to do with her. Should we kill her as we saw her kill others? Should we beat her as she beat us? Should we make her do slave labor as she made us do slave labor? So the group has a decision to make, and my mother had an individual decision to make about what would be her part in this if it got really ugly, and thus the name The Choice. In the last of the crafted stories, we have, which is called The Reunion, we have a young girl, Dora, who gets released from the camps, gets nursed back to health, and decides, I'm going to get on a train and go back to my village. And what village does she go to? Pabianice, where my mother was born. And where does she get off the train? Well, at the Castle Street station. And to this day, in Pabianice, the town where my mother was born and raised, there is a train station called Zamek. Zamek is the Polish word for castle. So to this day, there is a castle or Castle Street station there. Dora gets off the train and she walks to Pulaski Street. My mother grew up on Pulaski Street. And Dora rings the doorbell at house number 12. My mother grew up at house number 12. And Dora asks, can I come in? And the woman says, you can't have anything. It's ours now, but you can come and take a peek. So Dora steps inside and recalls the dining room table and everybody who sat around that table. And she mentions them by name. And the names she throws out are the names of my uncles and aunts who did not survive. So to this day, I don't know whether my mother made that trip and found it too painful to tell as her own story, or if she was just imagining that trip and chose to tell it through the eyes of somebody named Dora. Dora happens to be the name of my mother's mother. My maternal grandmother was Dora. So why the story is told as if Dora made the trip, I have no idea. But I learn a little bit about each of my lost uncles and aunts by reading the description as Dora reflects going around the table about each of those people. What follows is my afterword, and then a variety of things in the appendix, one of which is the full transcript of one of my mother's presentations at San Francisco State, including all the question and answer that followed. And often you get some of the best content coming out of people's questions. And in this case, these are college students who are asking the questions in a class studying the Holocaust. As I said, I'm going to play you an excerpt from that as the end of tonight's presentation. So we will get to that shortly. I don't see any other quick question and answers, but I want to pause for a moment and just see if anybody has a question. I would be happy to take it if there are any.
There's nothing at the moment, but
Nothing
I
at the
have
moment.
It seems like
I'll
as soon
just
as you
mention
ask, like then people get it together. So
yeah, I'll
totally.
mention that about a month ago, I did a virtual tour of Auschwitz. And so the person who was leading the tour was actually in the town where Auschwitz is located. And he spoke with a Polish accent. He grew up in Poland. And he was giving us a tour of the grounds of Auschwitz, showing us pictures of what it looked like in the 30s and 40s, and then showing us drone footage of what is there today. And at the end of this 2 hour tour, I thought he'd say, okay, it's been 2 hours. I don't see anybody with questions. I'm done. That's it. He just paused. And he knew that some of us, especially those of us with a personal connection to Auschwitz, needed to kind of get our composure, figure out what was important to ask. And he waited. And there were these pregnant pauses of a minute or two while he waited. And then a few questions came in, and then he waited. And I was just so impressed because he could have just easily said, okay, bye, everybody. I'm done. I'm going to go have a meal or whatever. But he was so patient with us. And I try to do the same thing with my audiences just because I know that among you, there might be people with a personal connection to the Holocaust, and it might take a little longer to just process and figure out what it is you want to ask. But I'll give one more opportunity at the end, and I will skip to my afterword. And my afterword is broken into two very distinct parts, each prefaced by 4 words. And I'm going to read you the first part, share that the 4 words that preface the second part, and not read them to you, but just tell you a little bit about where the afterword goes from there. Afterword. Don't ask, don't tell. These words seem applicable to a set of unspoken rules that existed in my household as I was growing up. Wanting me to have a normal life, to think of myself as someone with unlimited potential and not a victim, and to enjoy the freedom gained by emigrating to the United States, my parents focused on the here and now, not delving into their pasts when speaking to me. This meant not talking about the family members they had lost, which included my grandparents, uncles, and aunts. The names of these people were not spoken in our household, and as a result, I know almost nothing about them. I wish I could help you, the reader, get to know my mother, but I feel as if I hardly know her myself. She passed away 45 years ago, and now it's been 2 more years since this was published, so 47 years ago, and my memories have faded with time. She tried so hard to give me a normal upbringing, to shelter me from anything that would resemble her own shattered childhood. I think she was waiting until I was older, more mature, and curious to learn about her younger years, my deceased relatives, and what she endured in the camps. Had she lived longer, I'd have eventually reached that point, but this was not to be. When my mother died, there were so many questions left unanswered. I wonder why I never asked them. Is it because I, a rebellious teenager, was trying to keep my distance from her? Is it because I was too self-absorbed to ask my mother to tell me about her Holocaust experiences? Is it because I knew on some deep level that getting her to talk about those ordeals would dredge up horrific memories and trigger pain? Looking back, I think that all those things played a part in my not speaking up, asking the many questions I would ask if she were alive today. The next part of the afterword is prefaced with the 4 words, do ask, do tell. And it's an appeal to people to think about where they are in their lives. And if they self-identify as part of the older generation, to look for the teachable moments to share with the young people in their lives, whether it's their children, their grandchildren, their nieces and nephews, their students, their Sunday school class, whatever it might be. Find opportunities to share what life was like when you were growing up. And if you consider yourself part of the younger generation, don't follow my example, because I waited too long. I thought my parents would be in my life throughout much of my adult life. I didn't expect that at age 21 I would lose my mother. I didn't expect that at age 24 I would lose my father to Alzheimer's and not be able to have him recognize me anymore. I didn't expect those things. And so I encourage people, just as I do every time I make a classroom visit, I'm always mindful of the clock. And when there's about 2 minutes left, I always say, okay, you've heard a lot about my family. What about your family? Have you given any thought to who the eldest members of your family happen to be? And what do you know about them? And what do they know about you? Might it be time for a conversation? And occasionally I get validation that that's a good message to put out to them. As happened one day, before the pandemic, I was in downtown Ashland at the Dobra Tea House, and I was having tea with a very dear friend. And across the room, I see this young man looking at me with familiarity, and I'm looking at him like he's familiar, but I don't know why. So I get up and I go chat with him afterwards, and I say, "Why do we keep looking at each other with this spark of familiarity?" And he says, "Well, do you ever go to plays at the high school?" And I say, "Yeah, my wife and I often go to plays at the high school." He says, "Well, I've performed in several of the plays at the high school." And I said, "Oh, that's where it is. That's where I've seen you." And I was ready to walk away. And he said, "But that's not all. You visited my English class last year. And I remember you suggested we talk to our grandparents. And I want you to know I did that because you recommended it. And they learned about me and I learned about them. And it was a really good discussion. So I just want to thank you for suggesting that." And it means so much to me when I have a student validate that that message reached them. And so it was important enough to me to make that the theme of the afterword to the book. Do ask, do tell. I want to play for you my mother's voice. I noticed there's a few more questions, so let me take those questions and then we will end with this excerpt from San Francisco State, 1967. So, Sophia, what do you have for me next?
Wonderful. We have, I don't know if I should read the names of the people or not. I may as well, right?
Um,
No,
given the fact that this is going to be shared publicly, maybe people would
okay.
rather
Right.
remain anonymous. I
We'll
don't know.
keep it anonymous for now anyway. I did
Okay.
that for the first few. Do you have an idea whether your parents were able to talk with one another about these experiences?
I would guess yes. I would guess that they did speak about it to each other, though I was never present for such a conversation. And there's something else I want to say about my parents that it's tangential to that. Prior to the pandemic, the 2 years prior to the pandemic, each year, I was invited down to the Bay Area for a reunion of second generation survivors like myself. And we were all encouraged to invite other people whose parents had survived the Holocaust. So there were a lot of people there that I had grown up with. I knew them. My parents were part of their parents' social circle. A lot of people very familiar to me. And there were also people who were not familiar to me. So we just milled around and we chatted with whoever you happened to be next to. You'd chat with that person and you'd move on and chat with somebody else. And then the hostess said, "Should we do this again next year?" And a bunch of us said, "Yes, let's do this again next year." So as I was leaving, I said to the hostess, maybe next year we could spend maybe 1 hour of our time in a circle and we could all kind of share what was the experience like in your household. Did your parents talk to you about the Holocaust? Did you see them talk to each other about the Holocaust? What was it like in your household? And the hostess surprised me with her answer. She said, "I'd love to do that, but I can't." And I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Because about a quarter of these people will not come if I try to organize any discussion whatsoever." And again, I said, "Why? Why is that?" And she said, "Irv, it appears you grew up in a pretty happy household. Some of these people grew up with parents so embittered that that bitterness came out every day at whoever was in their presence, even their own children. And the kids have PTSD from their growing up with parents that bitter, and they do not want to go back and revisit it. And if I try to put them in a position where they're expected to share, they will just not come to this event." And so the second reunion was just like the first one. You just kind of chatted with whoever you were next to, and some people would say, "I don't want to talk about that," and others were quite willing to talk about it. So different households, different experiences. So I'm guessing my parents did talk, but not to me, just to each other.
That was a great insight. Uh, Another question. Have you talked with other survivors? Here we are. Have you found any insights as to the conditions that led to the horrors of that time? That sounds like a big historical question to me.
Well, I have read many, many fictional and non-fictional books about the Holocaust. I've really immersed myself. And if anybody would like a resource list that I've compiled, you can contact me through the university. If you look me up at the university, it's one of the nice things about being emeritus. You get to keep your email address. You can also use the contact link at the website, onlyhopebook.com. You can contact me, let me know, and I'll send you this resource list. So I've read many, many books on the Holocaust, and I'm reading one right now. And the one I'm reading right now is called Why? Question mark, explaining the Holocaust. And each chapter asks a why about some other aspect. Things like, why Germany? If this was going to happen, why was Germany the place for it to happen? Why in the 1940s? What were the political circumstances that caused this to explode in the 1940s? Why did non-Jews not do more to protect their Jewish friends? Why didn't the Jews fight back? And so each chapter is a why question. And I'm finding it to be very interesting. I'm about 2/3 of the way through that book. And when I'm finished with that, I'll probably pick up another Holocaust related book because I really immerse myself in it. Having recommended that book, I'll give another recommendation, which is a movie that I saw recently called Auschwitz Report. It's streamable, I think, on Amazon, maybe on other streaming services. But Auschwitz Report really amplifies what my mother was saying about, yeah, you could go attack a guard and you'll go down in a array of bullets. They'll be shot from a machine gun and you'll die. And you might think, okay, I'm a hero for having done this. But then the vengeance that's doled out on other prisoners. So they'd say, okay, one of you got out of line, 100 of you get to suffer as a result. So 100 other people might be hung or shot, or maybe just 10, but certainly multiple punishments for the actions of one person. And so that really comes through in this movie, Auschwitz Report. It also comes through in this book I'm reading called Why? Explaining the Holocaust. And I think that's a question that a lot of people have, which is why didn't people fight back? And when you come to understand the extent to which people were punished, not just themselves, but others were punished, their family members, for example, that it kept people in line and under control, unfortunately. Next question, Sophia.
Okay. This one's a little dense, so be prepared.
I'm prepared.
Okay. Do you think that by avoiding victimhood or the definition of oneself as a victim, that families affected by the Holocaust have actually been able to pull themselves away from the Holocaust? It goes on. Do you think that victimhood haunts many of the Jews today? Did your mother think that same thing? Do you think it is good to move away from that self-definition? You are so upbeat, and I find that amazing. That's the end of it.
I think what comes to mind is my mother was not willing to forgive. I think my mother held on to this sense of these people did really evil things. These people killed my family, but there's nothing I can do about that. What I can do is I can go create a new life for myself in America. I can raise a family. I can devote my energies to being more positive. And at the same time, I will tell my stories because the world should not forget, just as I'm never going to forget. So she managed this balance, or at least it appeared she managed a balance. One of the things I found in her belongings was a file of papers documenting the psychiatric care that she was receiving, and a letter from her psychiatrist to the German government saying, you are paying reparations to this woman for her medical care that she needs, and it's insufficient given how messed up she is. She's experiencing nightmares every time she sleeps. She's got tremendous insomnia. She will go days at a time and not sleep at all. She is really suffering greatly. She's afraid of fire. She's afraid of dogs. She's afraid of guns. She's afraid of so many things. And my mother managed to kind of keep that all hidden from me and from others and live her life in this way that anybody who met her would have thought that she's vibrant, she's vivacious. She became a travel agent and toured the world. And I've got photographs of her riding camels and photographs of her on cruise boats posing with the captain of the boat. And I mean, she schmoozed with people and she just loved to laugh. She loved a good joke just as I do. So I think the reaction that people had ran the gamut, and some just were never to get over their got over their victimhood. And I think my mother managed somehow to create somewhat of a balance that allowed me to grow up as I think a pretty well balanced guy. And I think I became a teacher because of her outgoing nature. She loved to be in front of people. She loved to schmooze and kind of hold court. And so I think maybe I became a teacher because of my own joy in doing the same thing.
That's great. There's one more. I mean, one person asked, are there any Holocaust movies you recommend, which you already covered?
I
And
mentioned
then,
Auschwitz Report. Another one that I've watched about a week ago is called Conspiracy.
okay. And then the last
Conspiracy is
question,
really a forceful movie. There are so many, but those are two of the most recent: Conspiracy and Auschwitz Report.
is, do you read any German literature about this time?
Have I read anything? Well, I don't speak German. I don't speak any of these languages. I don't know if I've read anything that's been translated from German into English. I can say I did go to Germany. I was very reluctant to go to Germany because of my parents' experience at the hands of the Germans. But a few years ago, my across the street neighbor here in Ashland, who grew up in a German household in Germany, his father came over from Germany to visit. And his father said, Irv, if you've never been to Germany, you owe it to yourself to go and see that the Germany of today is not the Germany of the 30s and 40s. And I made that trip with a lot of sort of elbowing from my wife. Come on, let's go. He's offering free use of an apartment in Munich. Let's go. So we went. For me, that was one of the most healing experiences of my life to see that the Germany of today is not the Germany of the 30s and 40s. And there are memorials everywhere. We went to a tourist agency in Berlin and picked up one of these guides that said, if you have a week in Berlin, maybe spend 4 days of it here in the city and then spend 3 days in the outskirts of town doing these things. If you only have 3 days, here are the things here in Berlin you mustn't miss. And if you only have one day, here are the real highlights that are not to be missed. And on that list, the Jewish Museum. They want people to see the Jewish Museum and all the history on display there. They want people to see this memorial that takes up an entire city block very near the Brandenburg Gate. And maybe I can even show you. I'm going to try to show you a picture of this memorial if I can, because I saved one. Is this it? No, that's the website. I guess I lost it. I thought I could show it to you, but there's a memorial that is really stark, really sort of ugly, that takes up a whole city block right in the middle of Berlin. And why is it there? So that people will never forget. For me, that trip was one of the most healing experiences I've ever had. So though I've never been to Auschwitz, I did go to Dachau. That's the one concentration camp I have visited. I intended for this to go about 90 minutes. As it is, I'm going to go a few minutes over, but let me end with this presentation from San Francisco State. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and switching over to that. Okay, so I'm back to my PowerPoint slides. And so what you're about to hear is from 1967. Now, this was an old reel-to-reel tape, and the quality was poor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick it up in the middle, and I'm going to read some of it that my mother spoke these words, but the quality of the recording is such that you might have a hard time understanding it. So I'm going to read the beginning, and then eventually I'm going to let my mother's voice take over. So you're going to see subtitles go up on the screen, which will be especially helpful when she's reading to you, or not reading, she's just speaking spontaneously to the group. And her spoken voice certainly has a different character than her writings, because she's just sort of making it up as she goes on the spot, as it would be different for anybody speaking rather than writing. So I'm going to pick it up in the middle of this presentation that she gave at San Francisco State, and then eventually we'll switch over to her voice. How would you feel in this unreal world? Could you imagine? It is not really real. It doesn't happen. It couldn't be happening. You sometimes think it's a different planet, that it isn't really you that's there. And then there is a final selection. You never know which way to run because one selection will take away the young people and one selection will take away the middle-aged people. The one will take away the ones that look still have a little flesh on your bones. The other selection will come and take the real skeleton-like people. So you don't know who they're going to pick and in which group to find shelter. So you rub a little brick dust into your cheeks to look healthier. Perhaps you'll pass. There will be another day. And by tomorrow, the war might be over. You march in front of the doctor. The band is playing. He is whistling a tune. You pass in front of him. He looks at you. You're naked, of course. With a wave of his hand, he decides your fate. Rechts, links, right, left. Not until the vans come and take away a group do you really know which group is going where and where you're going to go. Then we watch the vans going away, packed with bodies, and you see eyes, hundreds of eyes, looking at you silently, moving away. What is the message? You see people from the vans taking off their shoes, that's if they manage to have any, to throw them back to the ones that were left. They won't be needing them anymore. And then you fight for those shoes to get them if you're left.
So it's a struggle. But if you had preserved one spark of your identity, of what you were, of wanted to be, you have won. Dead or alive, you have won. And then if you're lucky, although at that time you don't think you're lucky, you don't know it, you survive the war, you find yourself alone, friendless, with no home, nothing to go back to. And again, you dare not yet think of future, so you think of the past. Now you think of the immediate past, you're filled with bitterness, you're filled with hate for everything, to the world that allowed this to happen. You hate yourself for having stayed alive while the others are dead. You think of the things you might have done, perhaps. Could you have put a little more of the brick dust on your little sister? Perhaps it would help her. Perhaps she too would pass this election. You think of these things. You think of revenge. You think a lot of revenge. And you also think of filling your belly, of having enough to eat, of having clothes, and a toothbrush. And you have to make choices again. Are you going to go through your life without having learned anything? Are you going to turn out to be a bitter, hateful person? Or are you going to turn your mind and try to see the world and yourself objectively and try to act and build a life that you think might be of some credit to you? You also think it might be of some credit to those that were not here to watch it. You learn, most of all, that human spirit is unconquerable. And if you had learned that, you somehow feel that perhaps you staying alive was worth all this. Thank you.
And with that, my mother thanked her audience, and I want to thank mine. Thank you so much for spending this time with me, giving me the opportunity to share words that my mother wanted me to read, but she also wanted to share them with the world. And I so appreciate having this chance to give you a taste of what she wanted us all to know about her experience and about the Holocaust in general. Before I sign off, I will take whatever other questions come in. And I want to mention that if any of you know of a group, a civic organization, a church group, a book club, any group that would appreciate this presentation, I'm always looking for new audiences to share it. I've shared it with both Rotaries here in Ashland, the Rotary in Medford. I've just been asked to do Rotary in Grants Pass. A variety of churches and book clubs have contacted me, but I'm always looking for new opportunities to share this presentation. It's a labor of love to me. This is deeply meaningful to me, and it also gives me a chance to spread that message about intergenerational conversations, which is also very, very important to me. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And I do see a few questions and answers. And Sophia, if you will
Yeah.
relay those to me, I'll
Um,
be happy to take any questions that still are out there.
Happy to do that. Mostly people are saying thank you. What beautiful soul words your mother shared with you and us. I think she won. I'm obviously. Um, uh, yeah, they're just saying it was moving and touching. One person's asking if your mother was raised in a Hasidic family.
Um,
And other than that, it's all thank yous.
my mother grew up in, my mother comes from an ancestry that had some of the most famous Orthodox Jewish rabbis in Poland. And my father and his family also comes from a line of people that were rabbis in his family. I think my mother was not strictly Orthodox. As I was growing up in Oakland, California, there were three synagogues. There was the Orthodox that, clings to every tradition just the way it appears in the Torah. You follow those rules. There was Reform that strayed from that a great deal, and there was Conservative, which was somewhere in the middle. I grew up in a conservative Jewish household. We kept kosher. We observed all the Jewish holidays. We had four sets of dishes. Meat and milk were kept separate. Meat dishes, milk dishes. Passover comes. We get rid of all the dishes, bring in the Passover dishes, meat and milk again. So it was a conservative, kind of leaning towards Orthodox in my household. I get the impression that in Europe, my parents probably had the same. Not ultra Orthodox, but and not Hasidic. But
Somebody's suggesting that you should put these stories on film. There should be a movie.
I've thought of it. I've thought of it. First the Kindle book, next books on tape, and then maybe we'll see about creating a movie with some of these stories.
So another question: have these tapes that you're just sharing with us been shared with the National Archives?
No.
Oh, well, that's a thing. We
I
got to
have a
get
note. I have a
that.
note right here from this morning's presentation, and it reads National Archives. Somebody else suggested it just this morning.
Yeah.
Yeah. The question was, have I made any of these into a movie? No, but when I visited Betsy Bishop's class at Ashland High School, maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, before the pandemic, I visited her class that was called Dramatic Literature. And so the students heard my mother's stories, and then they were given a writing assignment. And the writing assignment was either write a script so that one of my mother's stories would be turned into a little mini play, or take one of my mother's stories and write the next chapter as if these characters were continuing on and doing something, or write a story relevant to the student's own family. If they didn't want to write about my family, they could write about their own. And then I was invited back about 3 weeks later to actually see the little mini staging of these little plays, and the students are holding their scripts. But a student would say, okay, in this, I'm going to play the role of the prison guard, and she's going to play the role of Felicia, my mother. And I'm watching somebody bring my mother back to life, and it's a high school student. And I'm grabbing the tissues and I'm crying. And it was such an emotional moment for me. And then at the end, they all lined up and handed me their scripts.
Oh,
And it was a really special moment for me. And I still have those scripts where they
yeah.
basically brought my mother back to life as they imagined her.
Oh my gosh, you're doing the work. It's amazing. Good job.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, to all of you, thank you. Thank you for being
Yeah.
here. Thank you for taking this to heart. And thank you for doing whatever you can do to just make it so the world doesn't keep going through things like this. And,
Oh,
whatever we can do, if it's just spreading a little peace in your local community, great. If you can spread a little kindness beyond the community, great. Whatever we can do, we can't give up.
yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody for
Thank
attending.
you.
Um, Friends of Hannon Library thanks you. And we, I don't even know what to say. I'm very moved by this. So like, Dale, you say something.
Irv, I want to thank you on behalf of the Hannon Library, Southern Oregon University, the community of Ashland and beyond. The work you're doing with your novel and the work you're doing in your speaking and the work you're doing in your life is a benefit to everyone.
Thanks, Dale. Means a lot. I appreciate it. I appreciate all of you who took the time out to do this tonight. And be well, everybody. Thank you so much.
All right. Good night and be well.
Okay.